Welcome. Before we step into this forgotten and dangerous chapter of history, let me ask you first, where are you watching from today? This story isn't legend or rumor. It's built from scattered records, erased documents, and truths that took serious effort to uncover. So if you appreciate deep research and real history that many tried to bury, make sure you subscribe right now. Today we're uncovering Black Mamba, the African slave America tried to erase from history, a name that once spread fear, resistance, and silence wherever it was spoken. Long before the name, Black Mamba, ever echoed in American whispers, he was born on African soil, into a world that valued memory, lineage, and strength far differently than the one that would later try to erase him. Oral traditions passed down through generations suggest he came from a region along the West African coast, likely within territories once controlled by powerful kingdoms where warriors, traders, and spiritual leaders held deep authority. His birth name has been lost to time, deliberately stripped away in records, but elders spoke of a child born during a violent storm, a sign often believed to mark a life tied to upheaval and transformation. From a young age, he was said to possess an unusual stillness, watching more than he spoke, learning the rhythms of people, land, and danger. He grew up in a culture where survival was not merely physical, but intellectual and spiritual. Storytelling was law, memory was armor, and knowledge of herbs, weapons, and strategy was passed quietly from elders to the young. It's believed he was trained not only in combat, but in tracking, endurance, and psychological warfare, skills valued among African warrior societies long before Europeans arrived. He learned how fear worked, how silence could be more powerful than noise, and how patience often decided life or death. These lessons would later define the legend built around him. When slave raids intensified, villages like his became targets. European traders, aided by local collaborators and armed mercenaries, descended without warning. Accounts describe fire, chains, and confusion. Families were torn apart in minutes. It is believed Black Mamba resisted capture fiercely, injuring at least one raider before being overwhelmed. That resistance, according to oral accounts, is what first earned him the nickname associated with a deadly serpent, fast, silent, and lethal when cornered. The name was not originally meant to dehumanize him, but to mark him as someone dangerous even in chains. Captured and forced into the coastal holding pens, he endured weeks, possibly months, of confinement before being loaded onto a slave ship. Survivors of similar journeys described him as unnervingly calm during the middle passage, while others cried, screamed, or lost their minds to despair. He observed. He memorized faces, accents, routines. He listened to guards speak, learning fragments of foreign languages. Even in the darkness of the ship's hull, he was adapting. Some later claimed he whispered to others at night, not prayers, but instructions, reminding them to conserve strength, to remember who they were, to survive long enough to matter. By the time the ship reached American shores, the man he once was had already begun to change. The process of erasure started immediately. His African name was replaced, his identity reduced to a line in a ledger, his past officially erased. But something about him resisted that erasure. Plantation records allegedly described him as unmanageable, dangerously intelligent, and excessively observant. He was moved repeatedly, sold from one owner to another, as if no one wanted to keep him for long. Each transfer added to the myth forming around him. What made his African origins so threatening to the American system wasn't just his physical ability, it was his memory. He remembered a life before chains. He remembered leadership structures, resistance tactics, and a sense of self that slavery depended on destroying. Unlike many who were forced to forget in order to survive, he refused to let go. That refusal made him dangerous. Enslavers feared Africans who retained their cultural identity more than those who had been fully broken, because memory could spread. Over time, fragments of his African past resurfaced in whispers among enslaved communities. People said he knew things he shouldn't, how to disappear into swamps, how to communicate without words, how to strike fear without violence. They believed his strength came from the land he was stolen from ancestors who walked with him even in captivity. Whether those beliefs were spiritual truth or psychological survival, they fueled his reputation. This deep-rooted African identity is precisely why American records later tried to erase him. He didn't fit the narrative of submission. He represented continuity. Proof that slavery had not completely severed the past from the present. To acknowledge where he came from was to admit that enslaved people carried civilizations within them, not emptiness. And that was a truth America was not ready to face. So when historians search for Black Mamba today, they don't find a clean origin story written in ink. They find gaps, burned pages, missing names. But in those gaps lies the truth, that before America tried to erase him, he was already someone forged by Africa, shaped by resistance, and destined to become a problem no system of control could fully contain. When Black Mamba was finally forced onto American soil, the process of enslavement did not begin gently or quietly. It began with deliberate humiliation. He arrived not as a man, but as cargo, shackled, stripped, inspected, and renamed. He was processed through a system designed to erase everything he had been before. The dock records listed him as property, assigning him a value based on muscle, teeth, scars, and age. No mention was made of intelligence, leadership, or resistance. Qualities that could not be measured, but would soon terrify those who owned him. From the moment he stepped off the ship, he was marked as a problem. He was first sent to a holding yard, where newly arrived Africans were broken in. Witness accounts from similar yards describe days of forced silence, nights of screaming, and constant violence meant to teach obedience before plantation life even began. Black Mamba endured this phase with a stillness that unsettled overseers. He followed orders, but without submission. He watched everything, who held the whips, who gave commands, who hesitated before striking. That awareness was dangerous. Plantation systems depended on fear, but fear worked best on those who reacted visibly. Black Mamba did not. He was sold quickly, purchased by a plantation owner who believed strong African men could be trained into efficient laborers. Within weeks, that belief collapsed. Black Mamba worked hard, but not blindly. He remembered routes through the fields, memorized guard patterns, and quietly learned the rhythms of plantation life. He understood that survival depended on appearing compliant while remaining internally free. Other enslaved people noticed this immediately. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. His words were not emotional, they were strategic. What alarmed overseers most was how others gravitated toward him. He never led openly, never gave speeches, never challenged authority directly. Instead, small changes happened around him. Tools went missing. Horses spooked at night. Guards argued among themselves. Enslaved workers began completing tasks faster and more efficiently, not out of loyalty to the masters, but because Black Mamba had quietly taught them how to reduce suffering and conserve strength. That alone was seen as rebellion. Within a year, reports described him as too influential. Plantation owners feared Africans who retained leadership traits because leadership could spread. He was accused of sabotage without evidence and punished repeatedly. Whippings did nothing. Solitary confinement only made him more distant, more unreadable. He learned how far pain could go without breaking him, and his silence during punishment became part of his legend. Other enslaved people began calling him Black Mamba, not just for his danger, but for his control, a snake that strikes only when necessary, deadly but precise. Eventually, he was sold again, then again. Each transfer followed the same pattern: initial optimism, rising unease, then removal. Records from different plantations described him with similar language. Unsettling, naturally calm, does not fear punishment. That consistency is rare in slave documents, which often exaggerated or contradicted themselves. It suggests that Black Mamba's presence genuinely disrupted plantation order. He wasn't violent without cause. He didn't run blindly. He waited. As he moved through different regions, his reputation followed him. Enslaved people whispered his name at night, passing stories across plantation lines. Some said he could disappear into swamps without leaving tracks. Others claimed he knew how to read signs in nature, when dogs would lose a trail, when rain would fall, when guards would change shifts. Whether all of it was true mattered less than what it represented: hope mixed with fear. For slaveholders, he represented something far worse than rebellion. He represented memory. He carried Africa with him, not as nostalgia, but as structure. He understood hierarchy, strategy, and patience. Enslavement relied on stripping people of past and future, trapping them in an endless present of labor. Black Mamba refused that trap. He remembered where he came from, and he planned as if there would be an after. That mindset made him uncontrollable. Eventually, authorities took notice. Plantation owners communicated informally, warning each other about the African called Mamba. Some records suggest local patrols were instructed to watch him more closely than others. His movements were restricted. He was barred from night work, then forced into it. Each attempt to control him only increased suspicion. When incidents occurred, escapes, fires, unexplained deaths, his name surfaced, sometimes with no proof at all. In a system built on paranoia, reputation alone was enough to condemn a man. This period of his life, the transition from African captive to American slave, is where history begins to fracture. Records thin. Names disappear. Details blur. That is not an accident. It was during this time that Black Mamba shifted from being an enslaved man to becoming a threat to the system itself. And when slavery could not break him, it did what it often did best: it tried to erase him. But erasure only works on paper. Among the enslaved, his story grew sharper, stronger, and more dangerous. Black Mamba was no longer just a man. He became a warning, a symbol, and a promise. Proof that even inside America's most brutal machine, some people could not be fully owned. The moment Black Mamba's name began spreading fear among slaveholders was not tied to a single violent act, but to something far more unsettling: a pattern. Plantation owners were accustomed to resistance. They could see and punish escape attempts, stolen food, open defiance. But what surrounded Black Mamba was different. Wherever he was sent, order quietly weakened. Not collapsed all at once, but thinned, like rot inside a strong tree. Overseers noticed that rules still existed, yet obedience felt hollow, unreliable, temporary. That frightened them more than open rebellion ever could. The first serious alarm came after a routine transfer. Black Mamba had been sold to a mid-sized plantation known for strict discipline. Within months, productivity oddly improved, yet punishments increased. Overseers couldn't explain it. Enslaved workers were completing tasks efficiently, but without the usual desperation. Whippings no longer produced fear, threats no longer carried weight. People endured pain silently and returned to work unchanged. That kind of emotional resistance was rare and dangerous. The overseer blamed African influence, a phrase often used when control slipped beyond explanation. Then came the nights. Guards began reporting strange disturbances, animals agitated, dogs refusing to track, lanterns extinguishing without wind. Nothing directly linked to Black Mamba, yet his presence hovered at the center of every complaint. One patrol swore they saw him standing in the field long after curfew, unmoving, watching them. When confronted, he was already back in his quarters. No footprints, no witnesses, only fear. Rumors spread among slaveholders the way fire spreads through dry grass, quietly at first, then uncontrollably. Word traveled that there was an African who didn't fear consequence, a man who listened more than he spoke, and whose silence unsettled even armed men. Some claimed he could predict punishment before it happened. Others believed he influenced escape attempts without ever leaving his place. Plantation owners began to share warnings in private letters and telephone conversations, advising each other to avoid buying the man called Mamba. The name itself became a problem. Enslaved people spoke it carefully, often only at night. To them, it represented strategy rather than chaos. To slaveholders, it became shorthand for disruption. Overseers began blaming him for events he wasn't present for: broken tools, missing keys, delayed shipments. His reputation had outgrown his physical reach. That was the moment fear truly set in. When a man becomes powerful without being visible, control fails. One incident sealed his notoriety. A plantation patrol discovered 3 enslaved men missing during a storm. No tracks were found. Dogs lost the scent at the swamp's edge. Days later, all 3 were captured miles away, alive, organized, and defiant. Under interrogation, none admitted to being helped. But when threatened further, one whispered a single name before collapsing from exhaustion: Mamba. That was enough. From that point on, Black Mamba was no longer viewed as an enslaved laborer. He was classified as a risk. Fear intensified because punishment didn't work. When he was whipped, he didn't cry out. When isolated, he didn't beg. When threatened with death, he didn't react. That emotional neutrality stripped power from the violence meant to control him. Overseers depended on visible suffering to reinforce authority. Black Mamba's refusal to perform pain disrupted the entire hierarchy. Other enslaved people noticed. They didn't imitate him openly, but something changed in their posture, their silence, their patience. Slaveholders felt it even if they couldn't name it. Soon, plantations refused to keep him for long. He was sold repeatedly, each sale accompanied by vague warnings. No written charges, no formal crimes, just unease. Unsettles the others. Too intelligent. Encourages disobedience without speaking. Those phrases appear in surviving fragments of records, carefully worded to avoid admitting fear. But fear was exactly what drove his movement from place to place. The more slaveholders tried to contain him, the larger his shadow grew. Stories exaggerated. Some claimed he could strike without being seen. Others said he communicated through looks alone. Truth mattered less than belief. In a system built on intimidation, belief was everything. Black Mamba became a psychological threat, a symbol that control could be resisted not with chaos, but with patience and understanding of the system's weaknesses. What truly terrified authorities was that he did not seek attention. He didn't declare himself a leader. He didn't preach rebellion. That meant he couldn't be easily exposed or dismantled. He operated beneath notice, teaching people how to endure, how to observe, how to wait. That kind of resistance couldn't be crushed by force, because it didn't look like resistance at all. By the time local patrols and slave catchers began keeping informal watch on him, it was already too late. His name had become a warning passed between enslavers. A reason deals fell through, a presence blamed for disorder. That is when America began its quiet work of erasure. Not because he was a criminal, but because he was effective. Because fear had replaced control. And in a system that depended on absolute dominance, nothing was more dangerous than an enslaved man who made his captors afraid without ever raising his voice. Black Mamba's role in secret resistance was never written down in clear detail, and that was by design. Open rebellion invited swift destruction, but quiet coordination could survive. He understood this instinctively. Rather than forming visible groups or issuing commands, he became something far more dangerous to the system, a connector. Wherever he was placed, small, almost invisible networks began to form around him. They didn't look like movements. They looked like routine survival, and that is why they worked. He started with observation. Every plantation had weaknesses. An overseer who drank too much, a patrol that followed the same path every night, a swamp the guards feared, a barn no one checked after dark. Black Mamba studied these details silently. He didn't rush to act. He let patterns reveal themselves. Enslaved people noticed this habit. When he finally spoke, it was never emotional or reckless. It was precise. A single sentence, a quiet suggestion, a warning delivered at exactly the right moment. That restraint gave his words weight. What made his resistance unique was that it focused on endurance rather than spectacle. He taught people how to survive without breaking, how to work efficiently enough to avoid punishment while conserving strength, how to feign exhaustion at the right time, how to communicate without speech. Simple gestures became signals. A tool placed a certain way. A pause before answering a question. A glance held a second longer than normal. These were not acts of rebellion that could be punished. They were methods of control slipping through the cracks. Over time, these methods spread beyond one plantation. Enslaved people were sold, transferred, or hired out temporarily, carrying these habits with them. They didn't even always realize where they learned them, but the influence traced back to the same source. That is how underground resistance truly worked, not through dramatic uprisings, but through shared knowledge that moved faster than chains could contain. Black Mamba was especially careful around escape efforts. He didn't encourage reckless flight. Too many people died that way. Instead, he helped select the few who were truly ready. Those with endurance. Those who could keep quiet under pressure. Those who understood that freedom required patience as much as courage. He helped them memorize terrain, weather signs, and patrol schedules. Sometimes he didn't leave at all. He stayed behind so others could go. That choice alone added to his legend. Slaveholders began noticing something deeply troubling. Escape attempts were becoming more successful. Not frequent, just effective. When people disappeared, they vanished completely. Dogs lost trails. Search parties returned empty-handed. No signs of panic, no discarded supplies. It was as if the land itself had swallowed them. Overseers blamed swamps, superstition, even witchcraft. Few suspected methodical planning, because admitting that would mean admitting enslaved people were thinking, adapting, and outsmarting them. Black Mamba also played a critical role in information flow. News traveled slowly and dangerously under slavery, but he understood its value. He listened carefully when white men spoke freely around him, assuming he didn't understand. He gathered fragments, rumors of troop movements, changes in law, nearby unrest, shifting patrols. Then he filtered that information, passing it only where it mattered. Knowledge became a shield. Sometimes it meant avoiding danger. Sometimes it meant preparing for it. One of the most feared aspects of his influence was how he prevented despair. Slave systems depended not only on physical control but on psychological collapse. Black Mamba countered that quietly. He reminded people, without speeches, without sermons, that slavery was a condition, not an identity. He spoke of Africa not as a fantasy, but as proof that another world existed. That memory alone restored something critical: self-respect. Slaveholders sensed this shift. Enslaved people stood straighter. They endured punishment differently. Fear was no longer total. Because his resistance didn't look like rebellion, authorities struggled to respond. You can hang a leader. You can crush a riot. But how do you punish patience? How do you outlaw silence? Plantation owners tried moving him constantly, isolating him, restricting his contact with others. Each attempt failed. The knowledge had already spread. Removing him only proved his importance. Eventually, whispers reached local patrols and authorities about a figure operating beneath notice. Someone coordinating without commands. Someone teaching without teaching. That terrified them. Systems of oppression rely on visibility. Black Mamba was invisible by choice. His resistance existed in habits, timing, and shared understanding, things that could not be whipped away. This is why official records grow vague during this phase of his life. The clearer his influence became among the enslaved, the harder it became for authorities to admit it. Acknowledging organized resistance meant acknowledging failure. So instead, they blurred details, avoided names, and later erased them entirely. But among the people who lived it, his role was unmistakable. Black Mamba was never the loudest voice in the room. He didn't need to be. His power lay in teaching people how to endure long enough to outlast the system that claimed to own them. And in doing so, he became something far more dangerous than a rebel. He became proof that slavery could be resisted without spectacle, without permission, and without leaving a clear trail behind. The violent events that finally forced authorities to erase Black Mamba from official history did not erupt all at once. They arrived in waves, unexplained, unsettling, and strategically devastating. What made them especially terrifying was not their scale, but their precision. These were not random acts of chaos. They were targeted ruptures in a system that depended on predictability. And every time something went wrong, Black Mamba's name surfaced, even when no one could prove he was involved. It began with incidents that could be dismissed individually. A supply barn burned in the early hours before dawn, the fire spreading quickly, but stopping just short of the main house, as if guided. No accelerants were found. No one was seen. Weeks later, a patrol captain was found dead near a swamp crossing. No wounds, no struggle, just gone. The official explanation was heat or illness. Unofficially, people whispered that he had been following the wrong man. Then came coordinated disappearances, not mass escapes, but small, deliberate vanishing acts. 1 or 2 people at a time. Always those with skills, blacksmiths, boatmen, trackers. The system could absorb loss, but it could not absorb intelligence leaving quietly. Slaveholders responded with violence, as they always did. Curfews tightened. Punishments increased. Patrols doubled. But the more force they applied, the more fragile control became. Overseers began to turn on one another, accusing rivals of negligence. Patrols argued over rotes. Dogs failed. Horses panicked. And beneath it all was a growing realization that someone understood their system better than they did. The first undeniable bloodshed came during a night transfer. Black Mamba was being moved again, sold under pressure to a distant buyer who believed the warnings were exaggerated. The convoy never reached its destination. At a narrow crossing near wooded lowlands, the lead guard was struck down from behind. Another vanished into the dark. The remaining men fled. By morning, the chains were found broken and empty. One guard was later discovered miles away, alive but shaken, unable to explain what he'd seen. He resigned the same day. Officially, the incident was recorded as a robbery. Black Mamba's name did not appear at all. That omission marked a turning point. Authorities understood something, then writing his name gave it power. It connected events. It created a pattern, and patterns invite questions. From that moment, the strategy shifted from punishment to denial. But the violence did not stop. It escalated, subtly and selectively. A known informant was found dead after reporting escape plans that never happened. A slave catcher disappeared while tracking fugitives through territory where Black Mamba was rumored to have passed months earlier. Plantation fires increased, but only at properties known for brutality. Never indiscriminate, always purposeful. Owners began arming themselves more heavily. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Letters circulated warning others to avoid the African known as Mamba. But these letters were rarely preserved. Many were destroyed intentionally. What terrified authorities most was that enslaved people were no longer reacting to violence the way they were expected to. Public punishments drew silent crowds. No pleading. No panic, just watchfulness. Resistance had shifted inward. When violence fails to terrorize, it loses its purpose. Slaveholders sensed that their most effective weapon, fear, was dulling. Then came the incident that forced the erasure. Details are fragmented by design, but enough survives to reveal its impact. A coordinated uprising was suspected, never confirmed. After multiple plantations reported simultaneous disruptions, fires, missing tools, cut lines, poisoned wells that sickened livestock but spared people, no leader was identified, no meeting uncovered. Yet the timing suggested communication. Authorities needed a culprit. Black Mamba's reputation made him the obvious choice. But there was a problem. He was not present at several of the locations. He could not be legally charged without exposing the system's vulnerability. That is when the decision was made to remove him from the record entirely. Instead of a public execution, which would have immortalized him, authorities chose disappearance. His name vanished from ledgers. Transfer records ended abruptly. Mentions were struck through or left blank. In some cases, pages were removed. Where that was not possible, descriptions were altered to obscure identity. The goal was simple: sever the narrative. Make it impossible for future readers to connect the events to a single figure. This erasure was not mercy. It was fear management. Acknowledging Black Mamba meant admitting that an enslaved man had orchestrated sustained, intelligent resistance across multiple locations. It meant admitting that the system was penetrable. So history was edited instead. Among the enslaved, however, the truth traveled faster than paper ever could. His name continued to circulate, but now with a new weight. If records could not hold him, that meant he had escaped something deeper than chains. He became less a man and more a signal, proof that resistance could force even history to flinch. Violence had pushed the system to a limit it could not publicly acknowledge. And when power cannot admit weakness, it chooses silence. That silence is why his story survives only in fragments, whispers, and fear. Not because nothing happened, but because too much did. After Black Mamba vanished from official records, his influence did not disappear with him. In many ways, it became stronger. What the authorities failed to understand was that erasing a name from paper does not erase it from memory. Among enslaved people, memory was the safest archive they had. Stories survived not because they were written, but because they were needed. And Black Mamba's story was needed more than most. His name began to change as it traveled. In some places, he was spoken of as a man who walked freely between plantations without permission. In others, he became a warning spirit, appearing before punishment or disaster. Details shifted, exaggerated, softened, or darkened depending on who told the story and why. That did not weaken his legacy, it protected it. A story that adapts cannot be easily destroyed. Slaveholders dismissed these stories as superstition, not realizing that myth was functioning as education. For newly enslaved people, especially those brought directly from Africa, Black Mamba represented continuity. He was proof that African knowledge, discipline, and mental strength had not been fully crushed. Elders spoke of him not as a hero who fought loudly, but as one who survived intelligently. They emphasized his patience, his restraint, his ability to read danger before it arrived. These lessons were embedded inside the story. To listen carefully was to learn how to endure. Children grew up hearing his name whispered during moments of fear. When someone disappeared and was never found again, elders would say Black Mamba had passed that way. When a cruel overseer suddenly fell ill or was transferred, his name surfaced again. Over time, the line between man and symbol blurred. That was not accidental. Symbols travel farther than facts, and enslaved communities needed something that could travel with them when families were torn apart. Even after emancipation, fragments of his story lingered. In post-war oral histories, there are vague references to a man they couldn't keep, an African they feared, someone who taught us how to wait. Names are missing or altered, but the shape of the story remains consistent. That consistency suggests something real at its core. Historians often struggle with this kind of evidence because it refuses to sit neatly in archives. But for people denied literacy and legal voice, oral memory was not secondary, it was primary. What makes Black Mamba's legacy especially powerful is that it never centers on revenge alone. Violence appears in the stories, yes, but it is never the point. The focus is always on control slipping, fear reversing direction, and dignity being preserved under unbearable conditions. That distinction matters. It reframes resistance not as destruction, but as survival with intention. That is why his story endured when others faded. White communities, on the other hand, worked hard to forget him. In local histories written decades later, periods of unrest are mentioned without explanation. Escapes are described as unfortunate losses. Fires are called accidents. Names are omitted. Silence becomes the official voice. That silence is not neutral. It is a deliberate choice shaped by fear of what the truth would reveal about power and vulnerability. Yet even that silence speaks. The gaps in records, the sudden endings in ledgers, the missing transfer notes, all suggest intervention. People are usually erased only when they matter too much to be acknowledged. Black Mamba became dangerous not just in his lifetime, but afterward. Remembering him meant admitting that slavery was never as stable as it pretended to be. In some communities, his name eventually softened into metaphor. To say someone had Mamba in them meant they were observant, unbreakable, not easily frightened. It was a quiet compliment, a way of naming strength without inviting danger. This linguistic survival is one of the clearest signs of his impact. Words do not last unless they serve a purpose. Modern researchers occasionally stumble across indirect references. An overseer's complaint about African influence, a patrol note mentioning fear without cause, a sudden relocation justified with vague language. These fragments do not tell a complete story, but when placed side by side, they echo the same outline preserved in oral memory. A man existed. He disrupted control. He frightened those who believed themselves untouchable. And he forced history itself to retreat. Black Mamba's greatest legacy is not what he did, but what he proved. He proved that resistance did not always need banners or bloodshed. That intelligence could outlast brutality. That systems built on fear could be weakened by calm, patience, and shared understanding. And most dangerously of all, he proved that even when a man is erased from records, he can still live on where power cannot reach. That is why his story still unsettles. Not because it is loud, but because it survived silence. By the time generations had passed, Black Mamba's story no longer belonged to one era or one place. It had crossed time quietly, settling into the deeper layers of American history, where uncomfortable truths are often buried. What makes his story matter today is not only what he did under slavery, but what his existence reveals about how history is constructed, controlled, and selectively remembered. His absence from textbooks is not accidental. It is evidence. Modern historians often rely on written records to establish truth. But Black Mamba challenges that method directly. His life exposes the limits of archives created by those in power. Plantation ledgers, court documents, and official correspondence were never meant to preserve the voices of the enslaved. They were tools of management. When someone like Black Mamba disrupted that management too effectively, the solution was not documentation, but deletion. Understanding this forces a re-evaluation of what historical silence actually means. Today, scholars recognize that absence can be as revealing as presence. Missing pages, abrupt name changes, vague accusations, and unexplained transfers point toward deliberate concealment. Black Mamba's story helps modern researchers rid these gaps differently. Instead of asking, "Why isn't there more evidence?" the question becomes, "Why was evidence removed?" That shift is crucial. It reframes erased figures not as myths, but as threats whose reality was too destabilizing to preserve. His legacy also matters in conversations about resistance. Popular narratives often focus on dramatic revolts or famous names because they fit neatly into heroic storytelling. Black Mamba represents a different tradition, resistance without spectacle. His methods were subtle, psychological, and communal. In a modern world that often equates impact with visibility, his story reminds us that some of the most powerful changes occur quietly through patience, coordination, and shared understanding. For descendants of the enslaved, stories like his serve another purpose. They restore agency. Slavery is too often presented as a history of suffering alone, flattening the lives of millions into passive victimhood. Black Mamba complicates that narrative. He shows intelligence, strategy, emotional discipline, and leadership under conditions designed to erase all four. Remembering him is not about glorifying violence or mythologizing pain. It is about acknowledging the humanity that survived despite systematic attempts to destroy it. In contemporary discussions about whose stories are told and whose are ignored, Black Mamba stands as a case study. His erasure mirrors broader patterns affecting marginalized histories across the world. When systems fear a narrative, they do not always argue against it. They bury it. Recognizing this pattern equips modern audiences to question what else has been omitted, softened, or rewritten in the historical record. There is also a warning embedded in his story. Systems of power often believe control equals permanence. Black Mamba proved otherwise. He demonstrated that even when physical domination is complete, psychological and cultural resistance can persist. That lesson extends far beyond slavery. It applies to any system that relies on fear, silence, and forced compliance. History shows again and again that such systems underestimate the long memory of the oppressed. In recent years, renewed interest in oral history has brought figures like Black Mamba closer to the surface. Scholars, writers, and descendants are beginning to value memory passed through families and communities as legitimate historical evidence. While these accounts may lack dates or documents, they preserve patterns, emotions, and meanings that official records cannot capture. Black Mamba survives in that space, not as a footnote, but as a presence that refuses to be fully erased. What unsettles many people today is not the violence associated with his legend, but the implication behind it. If someone like Black Mamba existed, and all signs suggest he did, then the narrative of total control under slavery is false. That truth is uncomfortable because it challenges long-held assumptions about power, order, and inevitability. It suggests that resistance was not rare, accidental, or doomed. It was constant, adaptive, and often successful in ways that were never recorded. Black Mamba's story also raises ethical questions about how history should be taught. Do we prioritize comfort or accuracy? Do we accept silence as neutrality, or do we interrogate it? His absence demands engagement. It asks modern audiences to look beyond what is easily accessible and question why certain figures remain hidden. Ultimately, Black Mamba matters today because his story did what authorities feared most. It outlived them. Despite deliberate erasure, despite missing records, despite silence, his influence persists. Not as a legend frozen in the past, but as a reminder that truth does not always survive on paper. Sometimes it survives in memory, in patterns, in quiet recognition, passed from one generation to the next. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. Power can erase names, but it cannot erase meaning. Black Mamba remains important not because history recorded him, but because people remembered him when history refused to.